Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. My guest today is Justin Kollinger, Senior Risk Management Consultant at United Educators, an education-owned liability insurance carrier serving over 1,500 institutions across the country. In his role, Justin advises college and university leaders as they develop strategic risk initiatives, prioritize risk management goals, and launch or refresh enterprise risk management initiatives. Justin co-authored the book Risk Management, an Accountability Guide for University and College Boards, and he creates reports and tools that help UE's members address their top risks, including risks relating to enrollment and student life. UA and Justin just completed its annual Top 10 Risks report. And Justin joins me today to talk about these risks and how instituting an enterprise risk management program can not only help them anticipate changes, but can also save them dollars. Justin, welcome to the program.
Hi, Drum. Happy to be here.
My pleasure. Hey, I am really looking forward to this. I don't get a chance to talk with folks too much about risk management and that type of thing. And that's your business at United Educators. So if you would just give us a little bit of background, I'm fascinated. How did you get into risk management?
Well, a lot of us joke in risk management that we fell into it, and I'm no exception to that. My story goes all the way back to undergrad when I fell into admissions first, and then through time at two colleges in the Mid-Atlantic, I worked my way into consulting in higher ed strategy, and since then have transitioned over into risk management at United Educators.
Fascinating. And how long has United Educators been around?
We were founded in the late 80s, I think 37 or 38 years ago now.
Wow. And you're self-insured. You do liability insurance for colleges and universities. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, United Educators is what we call a risk retention group. We were founded during an insurance crisis back in the 80s, and we provide legal liability coverage to schools, colleges, and universities around the country. As a risk retention group, we are fully owned by the colleges, universities, and schools that we insure. And as a result, we're deeply invested in helping them manage their risks. I should note that since we are going to be talking about risk, that today's discussion isn't going to be a commentary on UE's coverage or legal advice.
Thank you. That's important to know. And then I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about that. No, I'm just kidding. So you talked about liability and risk. There's a lot of things going on right now, a lot of third-party lawsuits, low trust in higher education. Settlements are higher, awards or settlements higher than they've ever been. And then, of course, you've got fires going on. We just saw the huge fires in LA. The Palisades fires destroyed multiple things. And colleges and universities are concerned because students don't have homes anymore. It's affected colleges. Give us a little background on how this might work with UE.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I think a good place to start is what the liability landscape looks like today. You talked about the growing higher awards and settlements that we're seeing over time, and this is a trend that goes back several years now. We at United Educators and many in the insurance industry call this social inflation, and you can think of that as the increase in insurance costs above regular inflation. And I'm glad you touched on some of those things because that social inflation, we see it as being driven by many things, but three in particular. First, we're seeing an increase in third-party litigation financing. And what I mean by that is essentially recruitment of plaintiffs to bring cases. And these are often funded either by law firms or even venture capital type organizations that are trying to turn a profit. And I'm sure you've seen the billboards as you're driving down the highway. If you've been injured, call this attorney. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. And as a result, that's contributing to increasing defense costs as well, which of course then rises the cost of the lawsuit, the settlement, the award at the end of the day.
And the premiums to those folks who are having to pay in. I mean, you've got, about 1,500 members?
That's right. The increased premiums are a reflection of those increasing settlements and awards. We at United Educators, as a insurance company that's owned by the schools and colleges that we insure, we're trying hard to keep those premium increases lower. And so when we do raise premium, it's a reflection of the market. You also had mentioned trust, and insurance and lawsuits are a direct reflection of trust. I know you spoke with Dr. Courtney Brown from Lumina Foundation, Sophie Wen and Kevin Carey from New America about the drivers of changing trust in higher education and institutions more broadly. Liability is an indirect outcome of declining trust, but it is a measurable and financial outcome of declining trust.
Well, it's also interesting, too, in the highly politicized environment we are living in. Would a lawsuit against a college or university about having a DEI program, would that come under the liability policies and umbrella that you give universities?
It's really hard to answer that in specific or as a hypothetical situation because every incident is different. And as you mentioned, every state is different as well. It's certainly possible. And when we see increased political questioning of the role of institutions, higher ed institutions, and we see institutions reacting in different ways, that creates the opportunity for risk. But again, it's going to be very dependent on the exact situation.
Okay, well, thank you. I don't want to go into the prescription perspective, but it seems to me that with all the October 7th demonstrations, Free Palestine, et cetera, that could be an area of risk for UE. I'm just speculating. You don't need to make a comment, but that's, one of my prerogatives being the host is I can speculate a lot, and reminds me of a quote from a movie. You may think that, but I couldn't possibly say it.
Well, if you want to think about it this way, when it comes to civil rights on campus, and Title VI is civil rights law and regulation, certainly there can be instances where a student could allege that an institution violated their civil rights related to their shared ancestry, sex, gender, nationality. The list goes on. And so certainly as this, you could say, instability or disruption on campus as it continues, it can create exposure. But again, it's going to depend on the exact specifics of any given allegation or instance.
Of course, and ADA, things along those lines as well. So I'm real curious because you do this annual survey on the top 10 risks to higher ed. You started it in 2017. Why did you start this? There's a lot of other surveys out, but the top 10 risks, I mean, that sounds like something that would come out of Fitch or one of the financial sector type things.
Well, I'm in a really lucky spot here. I get to work with colleges and universities on helping them to resolve and solve some of their risks. But as a result, I get to see the insights that they're working on and then share them back with colleges and universities to help them address those risks. And this survey is one of those instances where I get to do that. Like you said, it is an annual survey. And as a result, we can track trends over time too. And you mentioned your Fitches and your Moody's of the world. But as somebody who works with risk managers, this is the day-to-day of a risk manager's life. And they're thinking about these topics all the time.
Mm-hmm. And if they're not thinking about them, and unfortunately, there's an awful lot of institutions out there. We had a conversation about this last week about risk management and ERM, enterprise risk management programs, which I'd like to get into at the end because I would say probably 5% of all institutions have a formalized risk management program.
I think that reflects my experience. Certainly, many institutions dabble, but if it's sustainable and there's a deep framework and history of ERM, it's pretty rare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've done many, many different programs and presentations on risk management. And frankly, I've only seen one or two institutions who really have done a good job in risk management programming, doing heat maps and all those other things.
Well, and that's why I like this survey too. It is an opportunity to be one of those inputs into an enterprise risk management program. And even if you don't have that fully developed program, there's still value to bringing a list of risks to your cabinet meeting, to your board, and say, here's what we're thinking about. A, what are we missing? And B, what can we do about these?
So let's jump into those top 10 risks, if we may. Obviously, the first one has got to be enrollment.
Absolutely. And that is number one on the risk. And as we go through this list, I think we're going to see enrollment reappear in many different ways. What we do in this survey is we give our respondents an opportunity to choose from a list of risks, but they can also write their own in. And if they write their own in, I see it and I have the opportunity to recategorize that into something that is consistent with the other responses. When we say enrollment, we're just talking about the people who said the words enrollment, admissions, or something similar. But we're going to talk about other risks too that are very directly related to enrollment as well.
As they should be, because every institution is tuition driven. That's your main source of revenue. It may be coming in through Title IV, maybe coming in through state grants, etc., research dollars. But bottom line, if you don't have the enrollment, then everything else is going to follow. Everything
Absolutely.
negative is going to follow.
Absolutely. And I mean, back in my admissions days, I mentioned that at the beginning, we all talked about the story of everybody on campus is working in admissions in some way, shape, or form. I think that's shown here throughout all university operations as well.
Absolutely. So what's the second risk?
The second risk was data security. I don't think there's any surprise there either. It's something that's not going away. It is getting harder. There is more at stake. And with AI, we have a new layer of operational data security risks that some institutions, I think, are more prepared for than others.
I know with my own practice or my own business, I go through an insurer and there's the standard liability and, making mistakes type insurance, but then they also sell one for data breaches.
Yeah, and as I understand it, those premiums have been going up over the years too. So while I have a really deep picture into liability coverage, I also have to think about where does that sit in an institution's insurance portfolio next to their cyber coverage and their property coverage and everything else that they're doing. It's not just one line of coverage where the premiums have been increasing. It's a lot of them. And data security and cybersecurity coverage is certainly one of those. I can even think back to when I worked on campus. There was a time when the IT department was trying to centralize a core IT function. And I won't get into specifics here, but the school that I worked in said, no, thank you, we're going to go do our own thing, even though the school didn't have its own IT department. And to me, that's one of those places where I go, oh, there's a data security risk there. You have one centralized system, and then you have all these other systems on the periphery that may or may not be being managed well. And those require and deserve a deep, careful look.
And if you're not doing that and you have a data breach where personalized information is being stolen, where you may have your, ransomware or whatever, I would guess that's just a little bit of a disruption.
Just a little. I was thinking back before this conversation today, and I remembered a couple of years ago, there was a closure following a data breach, Lincoln College. Yes. I think in 2022. They had already been facing some other headwinds, but this is just another one of those challenges that can sometimes push a college over the edge.
And, having a centralized IT group that looks at data security as well as keeping the lights on is critical.
Absolutely. And certainly with the addition of AI, we're starting to see more and more teams put together who are specifically an AI task force. But then the question to me is, what's the connection between the AI task force and your overall information security team or system? You want to make sure those are connected.
And I don't think it's too far off that people will start using AI to hack systems if they aren't already.
I was going to say, I think that's already happening.
Yeah.
If you think about the number one way to hack into a system, it's through phishing. It's through accidental disclosure of data, specifically passwords and account credentials. AI just makes it so much easier to send phishing emails, for instance, or text messages. You can mass produce them at a higher quality than before. So that further emphasizes the need for additional security training for every single employee on campus.
Mm-hmm. The next area was operational pressures. And this is something that's near and dear to my heart. New business models. The higher ed business model has been the same for centuries.
Yeah, and this one, we define it as risks related to financial stability, the institution's business model, and constraints on business processes, which is a broad way of saying how the institution works. And this, to me, has a really direct connection back to enrollment because they're talking revenue model. We're talking about the ability to control costs and bring in auxiliary revenue streams. This is one of those where I mentioned respondents can fill in the answers however they please. And this is one of those ones that turns into a collection of a lot of different things that I think people experience unique to their own institution, but so similar to others that we can see those same pressures across institutions.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, the financial is usually related, almost always related to enrollment, but there are other financial exposures out there as well, are there not?
Oh, absolutely. I think of government funding as one, and that's actually been a mixed bag, in some cases showing improvement over the years. Following the Great Recession, we had seen government funding for higher ed drop quite a bit. And despite the attacks on higher ed over the years, funding has oftentimes recovered or stayed relatively flat. And so there is exposure there, but it doesn't always line up with the bigger picture that we are hearing about in the news media. Mm-hmm. Of course, other sources of revenue risks include your auxiliary revenues, those camps that you're hosting over the summers, your conferences, any other business units that you offer, athletics, if your institution is big enough. All of these are, they're constantly at risk, but I think right now is a particularly precarious time.
No doubt, especially with a change of administration and who knows what's going to happen with funding there. Another big one, I believe, is recruitment and hiring. We're getting an awful lot of people into higher education without the experience in higher ed, making decisions that because they're in a particular position, it may not be in the best interest of the institution or the students.
Yeah, this one is so deep and it connects across the board, but I think it really connects deeply to the operational pressures we were just talking about. From what I'm hearing you saying, you're thinking about recruitment and hiring at the more senior levels. If you're bringing in folks who don't have that connection to education, who don't fully and deeply understand the goals of a college or university, you can start to get mixed or confused priorities for what is actually important to pursue. As a risk manager, I actually think about it from the front lines and vacancies among your frontline staff, your student-facing staff, because a lot of that will turn into vacancies for people who are managing different aspects of compliance, different aspects of safety, different aspects of student success. When you have those vacancies, inevitably, something is probably slipping through the cracks. Where nothing is slipping through the cracks, it's because the rest of the team has picked up the burden, often without the additional compensation, creating potentially resentment or burnout that is going to have its own negative effects on the institution. And I don't think any of this is going to be much of a surprise to your listeners, but it is important to keep in mind that the institution is very little without its staff and faculty. And if you're not able to fill those gaps, you're really going to struggle.
Mm-hmm. The other one that I'm seeing a lot more of now than I ever used to before is the boards of trustees, especially in public institutions. We just had a debacle here in New Mexico with Western New Mexico University, where the president was not performing, and the board, as a severance package, gave him $1.9 million, 3 to 4 times the amount he would have made for his annual salary. Obviously, the governor was not pleased. But it goes to show, and there's lawsuits going on, et cetera. It's a mess. But it goes to show that a lot of times your boards are not really in touch with higher ed, especially when they're political appointees. And let's face it, a higher education institution is like being the mayor, a president's being like the mayor of a small city, depending on how big it is. If you take a look at Ohio State, they've got over 50,000 students. That's a pretty good sized city. It's not Albuquerque, it's not a Los Angeles or whatever. But you've got all of those functions and a board member comes on, it's going to take them at least a year, if they've not been involved with higher ed, at least a year to get their sea legs under them to understand the way the institution works.
Oh, absolutely. You don't need to be a public university or a large university to have that challenge as well. At the end of the day, risk management starts at the top, and it is something that's cultural and set at the top levels. And so if the board isn't paying attention to risk at the institution, you're going to have trouble further down the chain. I'm glad you mentioned some of the big universities that are essentially cities in their own right, and I've talked to a number of their boards and their leadership, and a lot of them get it, which is really reassuring. But not all of them, and certainly those where the boards have their own, I'll say, just dynamics. Risk management is often left to the wayside.
And that is distressing because ultimately it hurts the students, and that's what we're there for.
Indeed.
The next one that came up in your list was regulatory and legal compliance. We talked a little bit about this, and who knows with, Trump 2 coming online, if it's going to be more legal compliance, more regulatory, I would imagine not. But it's going to change in a significant way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think change is probably the way to focus on it. I don't know if it's going to be more or less or how, but this isn't something that is new to a new administration. I mean, we have seen changes to web content accessibility, to hazing. And of course, institutions have been doing compliance related to financial aid and accreditation going back many, many years. But the compliance expectations continue to grow. And I should note, for our survey, we separate out Title IX compliance and Violence Against Women Act compliance from all of the other kinds of compliance. So Title IX will show up on its own further down the list. This is just one aspect of compliance here. And you mentioned Title VI as well. This was the first year we started to see Title VI pop up in the results.
Mm-hmm. I just did a podcast on that with a gentleman from another firm who gets into the Title VI ADA, and there's more and more of that coming out and new deadlines that are being forced on colleges depending on how many students you have.
Yeah, it's just changing rapidly. I think about the agreement that I think it was Lafayette College came to with the Department of Education around a Title VI investigation, and part of that involved student social media use. That was something that I don't think we would have thought of before, or at least off-campus social media use. I don't think we would have thought of that before as part of our regulatory or compliance duties. And it just continues to change and get more onerous. We just talked about staffing. The question becomes, who is going to be doing this compliance on campus?
Mm-hmm. Moving right along, we're halfway through the list, and there's still quite a bit. If we can just touch on these next ones, student mental health. This is becoming more and more an issue, especially post-pandemic.
It is. And I've been doing this survey long enough to remember watching student mental health climb up the list. I used to look at it and say, I think this is really a problem. And I want to see this on the top 10 list. Well, I do see it on the top 10 list. I don't want to see it on the list because I want there to be a student mental health problem, but I do want there to be attention to it. Fortunately, there are a lot of resources out there. I've been able to work with the JED Foundation personally in my capacity with UE, and there has been progress made. I think I'll give you two examples from the liability insurance side of things. First, this is one of those areas where I think trust is actually really important. If you're an institution and you show that you care for your students, including those who are under mental distress, you're doing a better job of managing your risks. There's one example from a UE member in the past where the institution did all that they could to support a student, and they documented everything that they did. Unfortunately, the student still died by suicide, but the family really appreciated everything that the college went through to protect their child and ultimately decided to not file a lawsuit. And so I know we often talk about student mental health as a student success issue and a student well-being issue, and we should. The impacts go beyond that, though, and that institution did a really good job of caring for their students.
That's really nice to hear because I've heard just the opposite tales. One institution, students were complaining, and we were doing a presidential onboarding and getting good background from faculty, students, etc. And the students said, we asked him about mental health, and he says, it's useless here. We call in, we have an issue, and it's 2 weeks before we can see anybody. I mean, all it takes is half an hour.
Yeah, and that's really sad to hear. It does speak to some of the opportunity, though, that telehealth has created to provide much quicker access to those services. We all know that there's a counselor shortage in the country, but there can be some creative ways to provide that help.
Yes. The next one on the list was funding. We've already touched on this a bit.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much more to add to it. Enrollment is really the driver here. I'm personally watching international student enrollment as a source of funding, especially after seeing what's happened in Canada, the UK, Australia. With the new administration in, I think it's prudent to be creating scenario plans and learning from our neighbors about how they've handled changes in the immigration and international student landscape.
And I think that's going to be critical. That's going to be critical. Here's one that's near and dear to my heart. Facilities and deferred maintenance. I remember reading, this was pre-pandemic, that deferred maintenance was up over $1 trillion. It hasn't gotten any better.
I was going to say, I think it's still there.
Yeah. So that's a huge risk.
It is a huge risk. It's a mission risk. It's a strategy risk. If you don't have the facilities to serve your students, you won't bring in the enrollments, of course, but your current students are going to struggle to meet the academic goals that you've set for them. It does trickle all the way down to liability risk as well. If you have a building failure, it's certainly possible somebody's injured by falling ceiling tiles or a window that doesn't close correctly or doesn't close at all. Unfortunately, this is not just a higher ed problem, but anytime when you have buildings that have issues like that, you do run the risk of people, for example, falling through a window that should have been supporting them, a balcony collapse. I think we saw that at a university a few years ago, a balcony collapse at a party after a football game. We think about, again, deferred maintenance in a lot of different ways, but this can have human health and safety impacts as well.
Absolutely. And, that ties right into public safety.
Yes, absolutely. When we say public safety in the survey, we're referring to crime, security, active shooter, the things that your campus safety department is probably working on. This is a risk that interestingly goes up and down a bit over time. Sometimes it's more prominent in the minds of the survey respondents. Sometimes it's a little bit lower. I think we've made a lot of investments in this area as an industry over the past 5-10 years. And I hope that they're paying off. I think that we've seen some improvements, but it's certainly a risk that I think we all need to keep front of mind here, especially for our campuses that have more porous boundaries with their communities.
And then for the first time ever, you had a tie for number 10 between general premises safety, Title IX, and political and societal pressures. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, our top 10 is actually a top 12 this year because of a tie in an inconvenient place for a top 10 list. I think that the general premise of safety fits right in with public safety. And then between 11 and 15, we saw transportation and sexual misconduct. All of those 4 risks I just listed, they were up from the prior year. And to me, that speaks to an increased attention on well-being and safety. I'm happy to see that, of course. I think we're all trying to focus on how do we keep our community safe. It does have a liability risk impact as well, as we are able to prevent injuries and keep people well on campus. So I was happy to see those move up, even if only slightly. But as a group, I think that those 4 risks have an impact together. Title IX, I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with, so I might set that one aside for now. But to speak to political and societal pressures, this one I think was really interesting for us too. I mentioned, again, people can type in their own responses. And in prior years, when people talked about external factors, it was very vague. The economy, society, politics would be the kinds of things we would receive. And we grouped them all into one category. But this year, those got much more specific. We were seeing economic-related things like inflation or trade wars. And on politics, we would see adversarial regulation and political attacks. And on societal pressures, we'd see distrust. And as a result, we were able to get more specific this year and add political and societal pressures as its own category. And I think it's telling in its first year, it's ranked 10th. In the past, external pressures didn't even always make the top 10. It was only sometimes up there.
Mm-hmm. What surprised you about this list, besides that last one?
For me, it's the consistency. Okay. The last 3 years in our higher ed survey, the same top 7 have been in some order for the past 3 surveys.
Wow.
2024 was a really tumultuous year. We had changes in athletics. We had changes in Title IX. We had a changing regulatory landscape. We had climate disasters. I expected more change this year, so I was actually surprised by the consistency.
Mm-hmm. What didn't make the list that surprised you?
Well, and this is, I think, speaking to some of that surprise and consistency. I would have hoped to have seen, well, not hoped to have seen, because I don't want these things to happen.
Yeah, really.
But I do think it's relevant that climate change or the environment didn't make the top 10. You mentioned the California wildfires earlier. That's a very obvious example. The hurricane in Western North Carolina is another example that hit institutions that weren't preparing for it. The wildfires in Hawaii a couple of years ago. The list goes on. And in my anecdotal conversations with colleges and universities, most are not treating this as a changing risk. Although I will say the ones who are doing some really impressive work. I talked to one urban university in the Mid-Atlantic. You would think that their landscape provides them some insulation from climate risk, and yet they had a very well-developed climate risk management system. And it contemplated everything from freezes to extreme heat, to hurricanes, to blizzards. And they were prepared for seemingly any eventuality. And I was A, very impressed by it. But B, thought that it could serve as a model. This is, like I said, an institution that you wouldn't expect to be prepared for anything. But if they can do it, I think it makes a lot of sense for those who do have those vulnerabilities to be very realistic about the threats that face their campuses, especially in the years ahead.
And when you take a look at those environmental risks, what comes first to mind is Katrina and Tulane University when Scott Cowan was the president. You know, they shut down the university for 8 or 9 months. They were running the university out of a hotel room in Houston.
Yeah, exactly. The institutions that have suffered a natural disaster are obviously the places who have learned how to mitigate those risks. I do think that it's worth noting here that I think we think of this as a property risk, a health and human safety risk, and that's all true. We don't always think about it as a liability risk, but it can be. If you look at the Maui wildfires, there were a group of organizations, not just any one, but a group of organizations agreed to a $4 billion liability settlement as a result of the Hawaii wildfires. So something to keep in mind, there's many aspects and angles to these environmental and climate risks.
So the bottom line on all this is, what should presidents be doing with this information?
I think you foreshadowed it well. The first thing I would say is make sure your ERM program is alive and that you have those linkages between your lower level staff, your management staff, your senior management, and the board, and that everybody's on the same page as to a culture of risk management. But just starting with the function of enterprise risk management, you can have enterprise risk management of many different maturity levels. You can have a super advanced one. You can have a relatively bare bones one. But I strongly recommend you have one because it starts that conversation. And I know you've done some workshops and presentations on enterprise risk management. So I don't know if you have any additional insight that you would give to a college or university that's trying to start one up.
Well, yeah, thank you. I definitely do. First, start one, put together the framework on how to start categorizing your risks, and then understand the difference between risk management and risk oversight, because there's functions at the university level, the risk management, figuring out what the risks are going to be. And then the board, it's up to them to do the risk oversight, to be able to ask the right kind of questions to make sure the plans are in place. I mean, anytime you do a strategic plan, if you're not doing a risk management plan along with that, you're leaving yourself at, sorry about redundancy, you're leaving yourself at risk.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. AGB, I worked on a book on risk management for presidents and boards that is available through AGB. So I'd recommend anyone who wants to see something, a guide for how to get started, that's available for them as well.
Yeah, or call me. So, Justin, this has been fascinating. I always like talking about risk. I don't like to have to deal with it, but, frankly, we have to.
Same here. 3
takeaways for university presidents and boards.
I just mentioned culture, and I do want to get into a little bit on that. We talk about often as a culture of risk management of everybody taking ownership or responsibility. That's true. I'm going to add to it. I think that our philosophy at UE can expand on that idea of culture. Our philosophy is a cool head, warm heart approach to risk management. And by cool head, I mean that we encourage colleges and universities to manage risk with thoughtful foresight and consistent application of policies and guidelines. Incidents are going to occur. Be prepared and take reasonable steps to respond to them. And then when we say warm heart, we mean to show care to your community before, during, and after something happens. I mentioned that student who died by suicide earlier, and that's the kind of response we're talking about. It really does make an impact for building that trust that we keep coming back to in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. And even the way you said that, died by suicide versus committed suicide, is a much better way of saying it because it shows empathy to the people who could be affected by his or her passing.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to take care in using that as an example, but I think it does go to show the importance of communication and making sure people understand that you really do care. I know everybody on campus cares. I've worked with so many caring leaders on campus, but the busyness of the day-to-day can sometimes hide that. So any chance you get to show that care, it makes a big difference for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
My second one, and the risk managers I know might get mad at me for saying this because I know they're already really busy, but if you're a president, please elevate your risk manager. There are people who know often everything that's happening on campus. They have unique problem-solving tools. They have an eye towards minimizing failure. And these are people who could be well-positioned to be strategic contributors, but they aren't always at the table.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, if you don't have a risk manager, get one.
Yes, seconded.
And lastly?
I'll say use your third-party experts. We at UE have a lot available to our members, like checklists, online courses, and personalized support, but other insurers have resources and experts available. Your insurance brokers have resources available. Of course, your associations also have resources and experts. We're all here to be part of this ecosystem to support your success. Don't forget we're here to help.
Those are great takeaways. Thank you. What's next? What's next for you, other than a wonderful vacation coming?
Well, thank you. I would say that I would encourage everybody listening to check out our large loss report in addition to this top risk survey. I will make sure that you have both available on your website so that you can link to them. We've talked about that top 10 list, but in the large loss report, we share publicly reported settlements and awards against educational institutions greater than $2.5 million. And that's an increase from last year. We had set the threshold at $1 million in the prior year. So that speaks to, I think, the urgency and the rate of change. But what I really like about this report is that it gives you examples. If you ever are talking to somebody who says, that kind of incident can't happen here, well, that report is going to have 20 plus pages of incidents that happened all over the country. And as much as I hate to use those as examples, sometimes that's what it takes to get change to start on campus.
That's a great takeaway. Thank you. I will add to that is when you read through these incidents, it may key your thinking to say, what are we doing about this?
Mm-hmm. Do you remember the Flint water crisis a few years ago?
Oh, yeah.
I know an institution that took the 5 or 6 news articles about the Flint water crisis and used that to create a tabletop exercise on their campus. And they didn't think they could have problems when it came to their water supply, but they didn't think it would hurt to be prepared. Mm-hmm. And I think those kinds of examples are perfect for that scenario.
That's great. And you just alluded to another thing is doing tabletop planning, which is so critical. We used to do that in the Navy for emergency response. So very simple. Justin, thank you so much for being on the program. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you have a great vacation.
Thank you for being here. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to my guest, Justin Kollinger from United Educators. Justin, thanks so much for joining me on the program. I look forward to the next time we get a chance to chat. Listeners, thanks much for listening again. Look forward to next time.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show. We would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.